Yo guys, I've got a spark which I'm going to use to ignite the fire for brand new hashtag Film Fridays here on the channel. Now I know what you're thinking, this isn't the same video as what I've been promising now for the last few weeks. Well, don't worry, that triple deluxe review is still on its way, as you can tell from the thumbnail before me. It's actually a video that's almost finished, so it will be releasing for next week on hashtag Film Fridays, alongside a revised Pixar ranking given an Elemental recently released here in the UK officially. So now I have a chance to review it and rank it amongst the rest of Pixar's masterpieces. But enough about teasing for the future of Film Fridays. What we're going to be focusing on for this week is none other than the Mission Impossible franchise. Now, I have not seen these 6 films as of just yet, despite me having the 6 movie collection in my Blu-ray collection for years now. So since this is Saturday, what I'm going to be doing here is that Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 might release on Monday here in the UK, but we're actually watching it on Friday. I have my ticket pre-booked and everything, you can see that on screen now. So leading up to Dead Reckoning Part 1, I'm going to be watching one of these films every single day, and so every single day for film corresponding to that, I will watch a film, and then after the film is done, during the credits, I'm going to give you my kind of initial thoughts. It's not going to be a review type video, it's not even going to be a ranking type video, this is purely a discussion based video as we binge through this entire franchise, one film each day for an entire week, starting on Saturday and then concluding on Friday with Dead Reckoning Part 1. I'm actually really pumped for this. There's lots of positive talk towards this franchise, towards Dead Reckoning Part 1 in particular, so without further ado, let's get watching Mission Impossible 1 already.
2 hours later.
Okay, so here we are, 2 hours later. We don't have much of a lighting difference because during the summer times, obviously the sun is out a lot longer, so that is where a lot of the natural lighting is coming from right now. But regardless, speaking of lighting, the film technically is very well crafted. It's kind of what you'd expect from a Mission Impossible high budgeted type franchise movie, though I'm sure that when they first created this in 1996 they weren't sure how much of a massive franchise it was going to spawn off to become. Now, the critics' consensus on Rotten Tomatoes is that it's full of special effects. Brian De Palma's update of Mission Impossible has a lot of sweeping spectacle, but the plot is sometimes convoluted, which resulted in 66% of critics giving it a thumbs up, so it's recommended by 66% of critics. But what's important is that this is based on 65 reviews, so 66% of those reviews are thumbs up and the others are thumbs down. That's how Rotten Tomatoes work. It doesn't measure average scores, they aren't taken into account. It's not that the film has an average score of 6.6. It could be that there's a huge fluctuation in grades for the films based on the critics' response to them. So some critics might have given it a 9, whereas others give it a 3, but all Rotten Tomatoes classifies that as either thumbs up or thumbs down, one or the other. But enough of Rotten Tomatoes rant. That's not the only thing that's going to be randomly splurged throughout this video, because this is a lot more of a spontaneous and relaxed type video. I'm going to have stuff like random trivia thrown about on the screen, because that's kind of fun to read and it's something to look at other than my face, fortunately, for all of you. As you can tell, this isn't scripted, this is purely discussion based. I want to give you my initial, just genuine reactions to these films, and in this case I definitely agree with the consensus of the critics, because it is a rather convoluted plot, but it's one that also keeps you engaged. There's constant twists, perhaps too many twists, because as soon as you become engaged by one plot line, something pops up which immediately makes that completely irrelevant, so you almost feel hurt by being immersed in the first place. And it is a very template type story, you know, it's the usual setup within your own ranks, there's corruption within your own ranks, and now one ex-soldier has to fight against his own cause in order to prove his innocence. You know, that type of cliche story, but cliches are cliches for a reason since they work, and this is definitely one of those defining films that really helped build the foundations for the genre, because I was going into this expecting more of a Fast and Furious type scenario, where the first films start out rather quite small, very character driven and not too big on the stakes and the scale, but I was completely wrong, as this film has a literal helicopter being blown up on the side of a train. It gets pretty mad with the visual effects and stunt work, which once again by Tom Cruise, that is top notch, and the tension throughout this film, yeah, it gets convoluted, but for stunt pieces, there's just one section in particular, a very famous section, where they're infiltrating this really secure building. And the tension and the dread that builds, it is spectacular, and it's really what keeps you so engaged. It's one part of the movie where it's not throwing twists and stuff at you, it's instead just focusing purely on decent stunt work, and it's using music to truly build that tension. In fact, the music in this franchise is what really elevates the emotion for me, and it gets you really pumped up and excited. It's a very adrenaline-fueled type movie, because one thing this film is, it is fast-paced, and it's also a rewarding watch, because yes, there are twists coming, but you are given plenty of clues as to where the twists are going to be taking the story, and so you feel rewarded for catching on to those clues, and it's Tom Cruise's acting that really points out those clues to you. It's not subtle, unfortunately, and that did make the twists very predictable. I saw them coming from a country mile, but that made me feel a little bit smarter for being so engaged with the plot, being rewarded by being engaged in the plot. So there's always, you know, kind of an upside and a downside to however you choose to make your film. And this film definitely has its style and its direction to it. It isn't made the same as other films of this caliber, because again, this is really a foundation, legacy type film that created something special, and then they expanded upon it, built from it. And that's what I'm looking forward to seeing in the later films of this franchise. I want to see how they all compare. Because here I felt like the characters were all very cookie cutter and simple. There was no real depth to their characters, because the story is focused so much on creating all of these twists and action scenarios. We instead don't actually spend much time with these characters. We don't get to know them as people. Ethan Hunt is just this mystery character, and I suppose it's meant to be that way, but it's very hard to care about a character who has no personality at this point. Okay, it's Sunday, which means that I have now finished watching Mission Impossible 2. Now, you'll notice in these segues between the days that I'm watching all of these films back to back to back, in those segues I have not Mission Impossible music playing, instead I have music from Sky and SWAT Force, as that isn't copyrighted, and it's from the Sneak Zone specifically, because you can still get that Mission Impossible-esque music without the copyright strikes, because trust me, the Mission Impossible soundtrack and the music, it has copyright slapped all over it. But speaking of the music, just like the first, it really does elevate these sequences for fast-paced action which your eyes just indulge. It's a lot to feast on, and it is so damn entertaining. The music elevates that. It elevates your excitement and adrenaline going into these sequences. But how fast-paced those sequences are make all the other sequences feel so dragged out and needless by comparison. Then there's the two lead characters who have no romantic chemistry whatsoever. All of the sequences between them felt so incredibly forced. And once again, it's a damsel in distress type story. I'm having a feeling that as the franchise evolves through the years, it's also going to evolve with more social norms. So I'm hoping less damsel in distress, for lack of a better way of putting it. And when it comes to the film overall, I felt like it was a huge downstep. I do like how we had a consistent villain throughout, one that we could have really dreaded and intimidated, because he is ruthless. We see that from the start, even though his character introduction is very confusing. We don't even see his face at first, which I suppose could have been used as fear of the unknown, and it really does let you settle into a comfortable, safe state. And then that's what makes the twist reveal that it's a bad guy a little more shocking, but it's completely unknown. How are we supposed to have fear of the unknown without knowing that there's something to fear in the first place? The character introduction, for me, it just didn't work. I can see how it would, but like I say, for me personally, it was just too confusing. Like, that's the thing, this film is both confusing and lackluster at the same time when it comes to story substance. It's just a end of the world type threat that, oh no, Ethan Hunt has to put a stop to again. It's another one of those, which is a perfect way of summarising it, another one of those. But enough of air quotations. When it comes to the critics' consensus on Rotten Tomatoes, they seem to agree with me. This is a rotten film. I'm going to go on ahead and make a prediction, the assumption right now that it's going to be the only rotten film in this franchise. From what I hear, this franchise has high praise, and from what I hear, it gets better as it goes along, which makes me even more excited for the other films, because even this being worse than the first, I can see how this franchise could evolve, especially with that, what I'm hoping for, lack of damsel in distress in future. My apologies for that stutter. That's what happens when you have completely unscripted Igknight. But for general, well, for critics' consensus, I should say, on Rotten Tomatoes goes as follows. Your cranium may crave more substance, but your eyes will feast on the amazing action sequences, which led to a 56% rating, very close to being fresh, and this is from 155 reviews this time, so almost 100 reviews more, so things really could have gone either way with this film when it comes to the critical reception. I was about to say critical conception, and which I suppose still works, but words, they scramble my brain, a bit like the plot of this film, because it was just so horribly told. The structure was all over the place, and the villain was either in the film too much or not in it enough. There was no balancing out the scenes and where they came into the film, where we needed an intimidating and ruthless force, we didn't get it, and then when we needed to take a break from that, we didn't get it either. His henchmen are just cardboard cutouts with no personality behind them whatsoever, so it was really only the main villain and Ethan Hunt to talk about from a character standpoint, and they have more chemistry than the two romantic leads of the film. What does that tell you? So when it comes down to this film, I will admit that the action sequences were incredible, and there was a lot less stealth, it felt like, in this one, a lot less infiltration. So naturally, for long suspense and tension that could have been built up from those sequences was just lost because it's too busy throwing explosions and hand-to-hand combat and good action at you all at once. And the action sequences, they really do give you a little too much to indulge upon. This film is trying to bake its cake and eat it too, if that's how the saying goes, because motorcycle sequences at the end, they're too long, and then all the other action sequences are too short. I feel like they was clearly going for quantity over quality here, and there was just elements of this film that I loved, ones not so much, are all meshed together into a perfectly average action film, a lot better than other sequels to successful films, mind you. Came out in 2000, which was when PlayStation 1 was the pinnacle of technology, so it goes to show that there was still some very impressive technical work going behind this film, and it's aged very, very well. It still holds up to this day, and it's just a really entertaining film, even if it has its flaws. Okay, so now that it is Monday, it's time for me to talk about my first time watching MI3, and might I just say that this was definitely a step in the right direction. Now, Julia gets married to Ethan Hunt in this one, Julia being a completely new character, so you don't really get an immediate attachment to her. You get an attachment to her through Ethan Hunt's character, a character that we've grown to care about because now he's starting to show more human sides to his personality, to his character, and you really do feel that chemistry these two actors have with one another. It's clear that on camera they're having a ton of fun, you know, being this married couple, to where Ethan Hunt has such regret hiding things from his wife, but it's all under the name of protection. And yes, Julia does play damsel in distress, but at least this one does have a badass female in it with Zoe, or Zen, however her name was pronounced, but still, she was one of my favourite parts of the film. In fact, the whole cast have chemistry with one another, especially Luther, who comes in with some of the most comedic moments of the entire film. So this is really where Mission Impossible found its necessary style, its point of character chemistry, to where it can be comedic, it can be action-packed, it can be thrilling, all at once. It's a perfect summer blockbuster, in other words. It's really going to be a great accompaniment to popcorn for the sake of turning your brain off and having some fun, because the plot does get a little wild and out of proportion at points, but the stakes are higher here, so it definitely does the classical sequel trait of going bigger, because yes, there's explosions, there's action, but there's also infiltration sequences, taking the best of MI1 and MI2 thus far and combining it all into one really fast-paced film where action sequences don't quite linger as long as they did before. They don't feel unnecessary and dragged out in length. And the villain, right from the start you understand who he is, what he's about, because we begin with the film towards the end and we flash back, so that allows dread to really build up, and then when we're finally getting to those moments where we're getting to the portion we've already seen from the beginning, that's where ultimately it clicks and you are so terrified about what's going to happen to Julia, purely because you don't want to see Ethan Hunt hurt by it. That is how you should create character dynamics. This just has much better writing, period. It has some really great directorial style from none other than J.J. Abrams himself. I had no idea he directed this until I obviously watched it, and his name popped up in the opening credits. this is a film which, again, it has those infiltration sequences, it has the action as well to boot, plenty of explosions, and so it's a blast. But they really could have done a lot more with Julia. This is just clearly the foundations of a relationship that I'm hoping expands further throughout the franchise, especially now that Julia knows what Ethan Hunt's background is. There's no need to cause further tension that way, no need for character drama, to which the ideas for character drama and for troubles that there could have been in that relationship because of these secrets that Ethan is keeping, all of that is explored to a surface level, but really this film knows what it needs to be and knows what it is, so it tailors itself more towards those action sequences and being a spy espionage film over a character drama. It doesn't need to focus on those elements as much because people come here to see Tom Cruise blow shit up, and boy, do you get that. The problem with Lindsay and her death is that at the beginning we spend all this time saving her. It's an absolutely incredible sequence. I love the helicopter sequence in particular, very memorable. But then she dies and there's no real impact on us. Like, sure, Ethan is upset by it, but we don't quite understand why. The flashbacks of Ethan training her don't come until later. I feel like they could have done with being much earlier in the film. Maybe as he's getting his mission briefing, that's when we get those flashbacks. We can see the significance, the importance of this character to Ethan Hunt on a personal scale. We could have really got those personal stakes behind the sequence, and it could have just really elevated the emotion of that sequence as well as the adrenaline we was feeling already from just the raw excitement and the visual spectacle. The critical consensus on Rotten Tomatoes is the fact that the film is fast-paced with eye-popping stunts and special effects. The latest Mission Impossible installment delivers everything an action fan could ask for, a thrilling summer popcorn flick. That's a consensus I once again agree to. It's 71% from 225 reviewers. So again, the pool of reviewers is widening up, giving this film more potential to fail on a critical reception, and yet the critical reception of this one is the highest thus far. It's my favourite thus far, though I still do think the franchise has length ways to go. Okay, so it's Tuesday, which means that I've now watched Ghost Protocol. It would seem as though my shirts have changed every single day for this marathon. But moving away from shirts, let's talk about Ghost Protocol, which is my favourite Mission Impossible today. Boy, does this really up the antics. But what I love about this one so much is the fact that it's still infiltrating, you know, large-ass buildings where Tom Cruise is hanging on for dear life with a single kind of suction glove, I suppose you could call it. It reminds me of the Paddington scene, actually, which hilariously Paddington obviously came out after this movie, but I remember Paddington, obviously that scene being inspired in turn by Ghost Protocol that came out beforehand. And I was super pumped to get through this film the moment I saw Brad Bird's directorial name on the opening sequence, and I must admit the comedy in particular definitely has that Brad Bird style to it, because it takes what's familiar about the tropes of this franchise and twists it. So the unexpected is what's so comedic, because you have the cool action hero who's walking away from explosion with his back to it, and then the explosion never happens, so he kind of has to turn around and pound the phone box to make sure everything happens alright. Simon Pegg can't seem to shut up, a bit like what I'm doing right now. I am basically Simon Pegg's character in the movie. And so that I instantly related to. Love the comedy in this film. So outside of a comedy, there really isn't any style. It is your usual espionage action flick. I mean, so far the 4 films I've watched could kind of merge together, and I could easily see people getting scenes confused between a bunch of them. Not to say that any of this is to be taken directly to heart. This is just an initial rambling of mine, because that's the joy of the structure of this video, being able to react to each individual film after I've watched it without knowing the wider context. I don't know what happens next, because that brings about me talking about characters like Julia and not wanting any damsels in distress. Well, moving from MI3 into this one, Julia is no longer a damsel in distress. In fact, she's barely in the film period. At first you think that there was a divorce that happened off screen, and then you find out that she died off screen, and then you find out that she didn't actually die off screen. The twists here are a lot less unexpected because there's no real build up to them. So it's not like MI1 where I'm predicting every twist 10 minutes before it happens, but there's also no satisfying reward for paying attention here. I would rather be surprised though. I'm very observant when it comes to these things, so knowing twists is always a satisfying reward for investing in the film, but at the same time I'd rather be surprised, which is what Ghost Protocol did to perfection by giving us only little snippets and then expanded upon those snippets in completely unexpected ways. Jeremy Renner's character here was so great, getting to see his character as he evolved from one state to another, and there are still clues enough for you to piece things together. This film does treat its audience with intelligence and respect. They don't dumb things down for us, and that is something that most other action espionage franchises would not risk. The lack of exposition is actually what keeps the pacing moving. Love that. What I don't love is the fact that all of these character arcs seem to happen off screen. Simon and Pegg's character gets promoted into a field agent off screen. All of the Julia relationship stuff, which I was really looking forward to seeing expanded after MI3. Again, I mentioned that as a hope, and then going into this next movie, obviously I didn't know that that wasn't going to be happening, though it does make sense, everything that happens in that context. But all of this stuff happening off camera is a massive nuisance, and for bigger nuisance than that is the fact that the crew seems to change up every single film. So the moment you familiarise yourself with one crew, the moment you start to really get to learn their dynamic, the crew is shifted up, and so all of that potential expansion for their arcs and their dynamics is thrown out the window because we're instead given a new crew. I suppose they are trying to freshen things up and make it so you aren't too familiar with these groups, but I really would just prefer them sticking with the same characters. I kind of grow attached to these characters and want to see them expanded upon, so not getting to see that and instead seeing these new crews constantly put in their place, having to refamiliarise myself all over again, that is a small letdown in an otherwise fast-paced, phenomenal film with action sequences that have so much more creative choreography and cinematography than what we've previously seen. The setting, for one, has a lot more production design elements that makes it stand out for its uniqueness. I mean, for ending climax, for example, Ethan Hunt is injured, but to no extent is any of this realistic. I mean, Ethan Hunt is a completely inhumane character that pulls off impossible feats, but then again, wouldn't really get its name Mission Impossible without said impossible feats, now would it? So that right there is what I have to say about the characters. I love Ethan Hunt as a character. He truly is a hero. At the end of the day, he goes out of his way to save everyone and everything as best as he can. His compassion is compelling. His intelligence is compelling. I mean, at the end of the day, this film, the MIF, I hope that's the correct term for it, that the entire force is kind of shut down and they're forced into Ghost Protocol, where now the main crew have no backup and limited resources, and they're kind of forced to wing it, if you will. All of these mistakes that they're making and just poor coincidences that pop up that put them in trouble, and a coincidence in storytelling I should say. It's terrible when a coincidence gets your character out of trouble, but when it puts them into trouble, it's so much more better, and that's exactly what this film does. Just coincidence after coincidence stacks up, and it's just an absolute thrill ride. You're immersed because there's such a sense of urgency with the time and the huge stakes, because there's just so much on the line here, and if our characters are screwed over, there is no way of them getting out of it, because it's established that, like I said, they have no backup and they have limited resources. It truly is just, as the critics would put it, stylish, fast-paced and loaded with gripping set pieces. The fourth Mission Impossible is big budget popcorn entertainment that really works. That is the critical consensus on Rotten Tomatoes, where 93% of critics gave it a thumbs up based on 254 reviews, and man, I would certainly be one of those critics giving a thumbs up on this one. It was just such a thrill. Cannot wait for the next one to see if they continue on this upwards trend. In number 3, one thing I did forget to mention whilst blabbering about that one, as I like to put it, is that the MacGuffin there, and all of these films have a MacGuffin of some sort. This film is not short of that, but the MacGuffin is what creates the conflict and the urgency. Again, this film doesn't have any of that in shortage, but for MacGuffin with a rabbit's foot in number 3, there's one sequence where Tom Cruise breaks into a building. We see all of the action, but then that action is immediately halted when we don't get to see Tom Cruise actually take the rabbit's foot. We instead cut away to all of his friends and we get their reactions to him getting rabbit's foot rather than him actually getting it, and that's just a moment in the film where you're like, oh, I so wanted to see that, and you don't. So MI3 has a lot of frustrating elements about it, which were completely slashed from this film altogether, and I did grow to really like the cast, even though it was infuriating at first not to have a more returning cast. Very dynamic, I'd already familiarised myself with, and I was looking forward to seeing more of that, seeing that grow and evolve, and yet we didn't get that. But hey-ho, I will take the trade-up for what we got in the end. Even Hunt's character at the end admits that it was the team that got this done despite their difficulties. They really persevered, and so that theme is really inspirational. Okay, so it is Wednesday morning. I couldn't wait to watch this one after the highlight of Ghost Protocol, so I'm here, like I say, early morning with my DC shirt of all things. But when it comes to Rogue Nation, I didn't quite like it as much as Ghost Protocol, but that's not to say that it's a bad film. Far from it, I believe the opposite. This is certainly a highlight for Mission Impossible franchise still. It's really riding off the highs of Ghost Protocol. The problems here is that it feels like it's essentially the same film. The plots are very similar, at least from my first impressions of them they are. There's no doubt further layers and themes for me to explore for these films upon rewatch, but my initial reaction is that Rogue Nation, just like Ghost Protocol, looks at the disbanding of the IMF, and now Ethan Hunt and his crew, they have limited resources, no backup whatsoever, and so they're forced to not only fight the bad guys, but also have to fight their own inner corruption and just agents that misunderstand their intentions. They're thrown into a situation where they're fighting on two fronts. It definitely adds to the intensity and the pace, and it is a fast-paced film, and boy does it have one hell of an opener with Tom Cruise on the side of a plane doing this stunt work, which is just so visually dazzling to watch. The cinematography here and just the technical craft behind everything is spectacular, but the reason that I prefer Ghost Protocol is that I just feel as though the mission setups were a little bit more creative. I preferred the settings, they were a little bit more creative in terms of the cinematography and the editing, especially when it came to the utilisation of the gadgets. They gave us really creative gadgets and technology, and then they used those gadgets and technology in even more creative setups for the cinematography and for structuring of the story and the plot. So ultimately, all of these films are already starting to amalgamate together for me when it comes to the plot of each one. But these films play to their strengths. They know what works and they stick to it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, which is why Rogue Nation is such an excellent continuation of the franchise. In fact, this is what leads to the critical consensus of Mission Impossible Rogue Nation continues the franchise's thrilling resurgence and proves that Tom Cruise remains an action star without equal. Ethan Hunt is basically the same character as he was before. He has a few corny one-liners, but that's kind of what you'd come to expect from an action hero. There isn't really further depth to his character, or again, not that I can see of, but I love his loyalty to his friends and his compassion. He is fighting not only to save the planet, you know, with the huge stakes, but he's fighting to save them as well. It's all captivating stuff that keeps you enticed in the film. It's definitely not something that loses your attention, even though the immersion isn't spectacular, because it's so unbelievably realistic. Every few seconds you're brought out of a film realising that this could not happen in real life. It is, as they say, an impossible mission. But they really do actually play up to that, the ridiculousness of these situations, especially Simon Pegg's character, whose awareness of situations actually adds to comedic value. And now all these characters are starting to get their quirks, which makes them more distinctive from one another. It's not like earlier films where all of these characters could have just been like substituted for other characters, would make no difference to the plot. Here, these characters feel a lot more essential. So, the writing is spectacular, the directing is spectacular. I just kind of wish for setups and for incorporation of the gadgets was as clever as it was in Ghost Protocol, and I also kind of wish the pacing was more consistent like it was in Ghost Protocol. Even though Ghost Protocol was a film that was more lengthy than Rogue Nation by 2 entire minutes, Rogue Nation is a film where I felt the runtime a little bit more, because it's almost 2.5 hours long, and boy did I feel it towards the end there. But that's not to say the film is without enjoyment. I can't emphasise this enough. I'm loving this franchise for so on. I can't wait to see what they do next with Mission Impossible So it was Mission Impossible Fallout time, where I immediately noticed that the cinematographer had a lot more style going into this one, particularly when it came to its utilisation of low-angle Dutch tilts, pull focuses, as well as lens flares. It felt like every other shot had a lens flare in it, and it resulted in a film that looked gorgeous, especially when the colorist came in and applied an excellent colour grade. There was a lot of orange and teal contrast in this film to really make the skin tones for characters pop, and the sharp, vibrant contrast was just absolutely gorgeous. All of the other films looked top-notch, they were very well shot, but this one took it to the next level for me. I loved Fallout's cinematography and its look. It was incredibly stylized. And the music was even by Lorne Balfe, which makes me feel a little less guilty using Skarner's music in the background here, because that was also made by Lorne Balfe. It's the same man we're talking about here. And the music just in this film, period, really elevated everything for me. Any emotion you could be feeling was elevated by the music. And when it came down to character moments in particular, especially with Alec Baldwin's character, what I admired about Rogue Nation was not only the stunt work, which returns here in its incredible glory. Like, seriously, these stunts are next level, and I cannot begin to overstate just how good this stunt work truly is, though I do think the directors of all of these films secretly had an agenda to kill Tom Cruise, because these stunts are just that insane. But when it comes down to the characterization of Alec Baldwin's character, in the previous film he went through sort of an arc coming to respect Ethan Hunt and the IMF, and that arc is kind of continued in this film. It's rather on the nose as to how Alec Baldwin's character feels about Ethan Hunt. There's literally a line of dialogue summarising it. But on the nose or not, it's still a fantastic arc, and it leads to a twist where you think that once again Ethan Hunt can't catch a break, and the IMF is once again against him and his rogue type attitude towards getting the job done. You know, they don't agree with his tactics, it seems, but the twist is that Alec Baldwin actually does. He was with Ethan Hunt the entire time, so he finally does catch a break, and that's a really nice way of exposing Henry Cavill as the villain, a really intimidating villain, because he's strong, he's bulky, he's also known as Superman in a different franchise, but here he's allowed to keep the stash. They didn't spend a ridiculous amount of money CGIing the stash out this time. And it leads to some really incredible action set pieces, especially for helicopter fight sequences, which aren't only visually dazzling to watch, but are really creative as well. So between the music, the incredible characters, and the twist, this film was just spectacular. It even had character arcs, which isn't something regularly seen in Mission Impossible. It's something carried over from Rogue Nation, including the Syndicate, which is now fleshed out a whole lot more. We get to learn more behind their motives and why they're doing what they're doing, and it leads to very high stakes. We're talking about nuclear warfare, which is where the Fallout title comes in, and that just really hooks you in on the action. And what's more intense is the fact that we've finally been given the time to have these characters evolve, and we are very familiar with their dynamics. We know how much they care for one another, so losing characters wouldn't only impact the character in and of themselves, but it would impact all the other characters around them, and we would hate to see that kind of loss. It would tear us up inside. So that dread, combined with the music, really elevates the action sequences, because we care for these characters. And the production design is so highly detailed. You really do feel that sense of immersion in these films, despite the lack of realism, because these situations are literally impossible to comprehend in actual human real life. Why do you think we don't see these in real life? But that's why we watch these films. They create such a great sense of escapism, given the lack of real world antics that take place in them. You know, we don't have to worry about the real world whilst watching these films, because we're invested in a world unlike our own. It might look like ours, but in reality, let's be honest, physics in these films are just thrown out the window entirely. And that leads us to Julia and Ethan Hunt. We've been talking about character dynamics, and they aren't in the film a whole lot. Julia is just kind of like a pleasant cameo, in other words, but we still get that sense of dynamicism. I'm not sure if that's even a word, but point is, there's a relationship there between Ethan Hunt and Julia, and we still feel that, even without them sharing much screen time together. We still come to understand their care and love for one another, which is really captivating character writing. And overall, Fallout was just a film I really enjoyed. I love how it carried on from Rogue Nation, it expanded upon it, and actually made Rogue Nation a better film, because going back to that and rewatching that, I'm sure I would have a greater understanding of the background context and the background characters and just everything that goes into these films. I'm sure I'd have a more fully fledged opinion period if I've gone back and watched them multiple times, because this is purely a first reaction basis. Don't take these opinions as final. Okay, so I'm now back from watching Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 in a theatre. It's the first time I've watched a Mission Impossible film in a theatre, and might have just say that I've been missing out not watching these films in theatres, because it's clear that the theatrical experience is what these films were intended for. Watching it on the big screen was amazing. And speaking of amazing, the reviews across the board for this film are pretty stellar. We have 96% on Rotten Tomatoes, with a consensus with world-thrilling stakes and epic set pieces to match that massive title. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 proves that this is still a franchise you should choose to accept. Now that is obviously a joke and a pun on the Mission Impossible phrase, your mission should you choose to accept it. So it's a pretty clever consensus there, and for 96%, I do think it's a little high, especially for 94 audience score as well. That's a little high. It's a combined score of 190% out of possible 200%. A lot of that has got to be recency bias, or maybe I'm just missing something. Maybe there's a lot more to this franchise than meets the eye, because this is me having only watched all of the films once, and whilst I have thoroughly enjoyed them, and they're definitely a lot more substantial, with a lot better character writing and far more creative setups than literally every other action franchise I've seen. Outside of that, I still don't see how that makes this franchise that much more special than Fast and Furious, except for the fact that you get these once every 5 or so years. So the rarity of these films do make them feel a little bit more special, but outside of that, I just don't think there are really heavy themes, and these don't really, you know, go as depthful studies of humanity. But who really needs that from an action film, right? This is a franchise that, I've said this time and time again, with every film I've realised that every film plays to the strengths of the tropes and conventions that are set up by the previous Mission Impossible film. They take what works, continue to expand upon it, refine it. And this, whilst I didn't like Dead Reckoning Part 1 as much as I did Fallout and Ghost Protocol, it's still a fantastic film with some incredible stunt work and some very creative sequences. The airport sequence in particular had a lot of tension. It was very creatively set up. The acting was phenomenal, because Hayley Atwell and Tom Cruise play off each other very, very well. There was a lot of chemistry there. And the emotional beats really hit, because the music elevates upon them. My apologies that the lighting keeps fluctuating here, apparently, even though it's later at night after the film has finished. The lighting outside my window still doesn't seem to want to be consistent. That's the UK for you, but because of how late the film finished, this video will likely come out on Saturday, despite it being for Film Fridays. But enough of that ramble. Getting back to Dead Reckoning Part 1. We have new characters here, as well as old characters that have just kind of been shoved to the sidelines without explanation. I mean, Brent's character wasn't in the last one as well, so it is a little frustrating, these characters disappearing on us without reason. Any franchise that gives you something good and then just takes it away and doesn't even give you a single line to explain it is rather frustrating to an audience who's came to invest themselves in that particular element. But whilst those films aren't really great at handling those characters that just suddenly disappear, the films are very good at giving you a setup and then fulfilling upon that setup. So they will give you a lingering shot of a weapon or an object, and that will become an important weapon or object. The characters at some point will be utilising said object. It won't go to waste. These films are so fast-paced because they don't waste shots. Everything is meaningful. And that's just fantastic filmmaking right there. And that's the thing, these plots, how they weave everything together in the end, like the twist, everything makes sense. There are certainly plot holes, but it's all wrapped up in a neat little bow, if you go as far to say. Dead Reckoning Part 1 doesn't only have thrilling airport sequences and thrilling character moments though, or emotional character moments, I should go as far to say, but it also makes the stakes very high and very personal. Gabriel is a villain, very personal for Ethan Hunt and his past, so there's a lot of just emotional tension going on there. And the franchise has even became self-aware that Ethan Hunt has really been thrown through the ringer with his poor luck when it comes to just the IMF and the government constantly betraying him and throwing him to the side. One of the characters even has lines of dialogue kind of exploring this very idea, so it's nice that the films are garnering that sort of self-awareness, and the train sequence is just amazing. It reminded me of Uncharted 2. In fact, I think the train sequence is a better adaptation of the Uncharted video games than what the Uncharted film was a couple of years back. Tom Cruise would make a great Nathan Drake, even though he's a little bit too much on the older side, a bit like Tom Holland was a bit too much on the younger side. That being said, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, it's got me excited for Part 2, even though this cliffhanger is one of those where you're still satisfied, and I'm happy to wait 5 or 6 years to see this story wrap up, because rather than these Part 1s constantly ending on a rather downer note, a rather, oh my lord, these characters are screwed, what are they going to do now? Instead, this is a much more hopeful ending, at least that's what it felt like to me initially. There's lots of stuff they can expand upon from here, and Elena's character, spoiler alert for Dead Reckoning right now. But she dies in this film, and that is awful. But her inclusion in the last film, because it was so personal with them bringing back Lane as a villain and her needing to terminate him for the sake of her garnering her freedom, the fact that they give characters a real reason to be there. I mean, Benji is purely there for the sake of what he owes his friends, and that is a dynamic that works really well with Ethan Hunt's character. But Elena being there for the sake of Lane, and then given a choice at the end of Fallout between obviously killing Lane, but instead she knocks him out and saves Benji. She puts her friend first, and a character is defined by the choices they make. So that's what makes you care about her character a little bit more. And because you go into Dead Reckoning Part 1 really caring for this character, that's, combined with music, what makes that moment so emotional for me. So yes, the stunt work, amazing on the big screen. The sound was also incredible. I've already sung praises for the music. Sequences that could have just been regular are elevated by the music, because when they're escaping from the airport, you're thinking, well, they're aborting the mission, they're getting out of there, so they are saving themselves from what could be a terrible situation. Yet you feel as though they're putting themselves into more danger by abandoning the mission because of the music that plays in the background. It's all fantastically made, as is the rest of the series. If I were to rank them, Ghost Protocol is obviously my favourite, given how much I had to say about that one. But then I also really liked Fallout, Dead Reckoning Part 1, and then obviously squeezed in between them is Rogue Nation and Mission Impossible 3. But the initial trilogy is kind of its own entity, and then from Ghost Protocol onwards they just changed up and elevated their style and expanded upon what worked for those first 3 movies. They really found the formula and kept to it. So Ghost Protocol is effectively the Fast Five for this franchise, where they really turned it on its head. That's not to say the first trilogy didn't have its moments, because boy did it have some incredible stunt work still. And the sets, the production for all of these films are top notch. You can see where the budget goes into producing these sets and just making them look real authentic, again with that immersion I talked about earlier in the video. But that's enough of that. I think I've rambled on long enough. This video is, it's already hit the 40-minute mark, so I think it's time to conclude it there. Let's roll that outro without further ado. I cannot, in good conscience, end off this video without first thanking all of my incredible channel members whose continued support help make these videos possible. Without them, these videos would be near impossible to make, so from the bottom of my heart, I truly appreciate every last one of them. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, there are plenty of options on screen now to explore, and please consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content. On that note, this video is coming to an end, so thank you so much as always for watching. Until the next video arises, peace!